She was just a humble housekeeper, cleaning floors while the storm raged outside, when a dying billionaire handed her a mysterious box and a promise she couldn't refuse. He begged her to deliver it to his estranged daughter, a woman she had never met, warning her not to open it, and then he was gone forever. But when she faced the daughter, the box revealed secrets, childhood memories, and a hidden map that could change an entire town. With every step, she uncovers whispers of forgiveness, betrayal, and a fortune meant to heal more than one broken heart. Can a single act of loyalty really transform a family, a community, and the life of one unsuspecting maid? Or will the past destroy everything before the truth comes out? The autumn wind howled against the windows of the Bainbridge estate as Maggie Carter wiped down the last of the kitchen counters. Her shoulders ached from hours of scrubbing and polishing, but that was nothing new. The old mansion needed constant attention, much like its owner. Every evening ended this way, her hands raw from cleaning solutions, back sore from bending over sinks and bathtubs, but there was something satisfying about bringing order to the sprawling house that had become as familiar to her as her own modest home. The grandfather clock in the hall struck midnight, its deep chimes echoing through the empty corridors, when Martha, the night nurse, appeared in the doorway. Her face was drawn with worry, the usual calm professionalism replaced by something Maggie hadn't seen before, genuine fear. Her thin fingers clutched the door frame, as if for support. "Maggie, Mr. Bainbridge is asking for you. Specifically you," Martha said, her voice barely above a whisper. Maggie's hand stilled on the counter, the cleaning cloth dripping quietly onto the polished granite. In 15 years of working here, she'd barely exchanged more than polite greetings with Elliot Bainbridge. He was a shadow that moved through the halls, a voice behind closed doors, a man who signed her paychecks but rarely acknowledged her presence. Is he okay?" she asked, already knowing the answer from Martha's expression. Martha's lips tightened, creating small lines around her mouth. "Just come quickly, please. He's insistent and he's not well tonight." Following Martha up the curved staircase, Maggie's practical shoes made no sound on the thick carpet. Lightning flashed through the tall windows, casting strange, elongated shadows on the wood-panelled walls. Portraits of Bainbridge ancestors seemed to watch her ascent with painted eyes that held generations of judgment. The house creaked and settled around them, as if the very building sensed something monumental was about to happen. The master bedroom smelled of medicine and leather-bound books, an oddly intimate combination that spoke of both vulnerability and intellect. Elliot Bainbridge lay propped against silk pillows, his once commanding frame now frail beneath the expensive Egyptian cotton blankets. The man who had built an empire from nothing, whose name adorned half the buildings in town, now seemed small against the massive four-poster bed. But his eyes, when they found her, were sharp and clear, the same penetrating gaze that had intimidated business rivals for decades. "Mrs. Carter," he said, his voice a dry whisper that nonetheless carried the authority of someone used to being obeyed. "Please, come closer." Maggie stepped forward, her hands clasped in front of her uniform, feeling oddly formal and out of place in this most private of rooms. Thunder rolled outside, rattling the window panes as she waited, wondering what this man could possibly want from her at such an hour. "You brought me tea once," he said, his gaze never leaving her face. "Years ago, when I was working late in my study. Earl Grey with honey. You said your mother always claimed it helped with sleepless nights." A ghost of a smile played on his lips, as if the memory provided some comfort in these final hours. Maggie remembered that night, though she was surprised he did. It had been during her first year of employment, when she was still learning the rhythms of the house. She'd found him hunched over documents, rubbing his temples. "Yes, sir," she replied softly. "Such a small thing." His smile was tired but genuine, transforming his gaunt face into something almost kind. "But you saw someone who needed kindness, not just their employer. I never forgot that. It was the first time in years someone had treated me like a human being, not just a bank account or a name in the papers." His fingers plucked restlessly at the edge of his blanket, betraying an uncharacteristic nervousness. He reached for something on his bedside table, his movements careful and deliberate, as if each one required tremendous effort. "I need one more act of kindness from you, Mrs. Carter." The words seemed to cost him something precious. From a drawer he withdrew an envelope, cream-colored and heavy with expensive stationery, and a small wooden box, expertly carved with intricate patterns that swirled and danced across the polished surface. Tiny flowers and vines created a border around what appeared to be a family crest. A brass key gleamed in the low lamplight, catching the golden glow and reflecting it back like a tiny star. "My daughter, Rose," he said, holding them out with trembling hands. "I need you to get these to her. Personally, promise me." The desperation in his voice was unmistakable, a plea from a man who had likely never begged for anything in his life. Maggie accepted the items, feeling their weight in her hands. Physical objects that somehow carried something much heavier than wood and paper. "Of course, Mr. Bainbridge, but surely in the morning," she began, thinking of proper channels, of lawyers and family protocols. "No." His voice gained strength, a flash of the commanding businessman he once was. "You must promise. And the box." A cough shook him, rattling through his chest like stones in a tin can. "You must not open it. Only Rose can do that. Promise me both things, Mrs. Carter." His fingers gripped her wrist with surprising strength. "I promise," Maggie said softly, meaning it with all her heart. "I'll deliver them to Rose myself, and I won't open the box." She could see the trust in his eyes, and it humbled her. This man who trusted no one was entrusting her with what seemed to be his final wish. Relief softened his features, melting away years of hard decisions and harder consequences. "There's something else, something to tell her, so she'll know." His voice grew fainter, like a radio losing its signal. A lullaby. When she was small, on stormy nights like this, I would sing Somewhere Over the Rainbow. She always said I sang it wrong, mixed up the words. His eyes drifted past Maggie to some distant memory, seeing a little girl instead of his housekeeper. Tears gathered in Maggie's eyes as she watched this powerful man drift back into a tender memory. She had never imagined him as a father singing lullabies, had never connected the stern businessman with someone who would comfort a frightened child during a storm. It seemed almost sacred, this glimpse into who he had once been. "Tell her I remember," he whispered, each word floating in the air like dandelion seeds, fragile and full of possibility. Martha stepped forward, pressing her fingers against his wrist, her expression growing grave as she checked his pulse. "I'm calling Dr. Stevens," she said quietly, reaching for the phone on the nightstand, her movements efficient despite the emotion tightening her voice. Maggie stood there, holding the envelope and box, as more staff began arriving. The night manager appeared in his hastily buttoned shirt, then the security team with their solemn faces and quiet radios. Phone calls were made in hushed voices, creating a background murmur like distant bees. Important people would need to be notified. Board members, business partners, the mayor who owed his election to Bainbridge donations. Through it all, Maggie remained in her corner, watching as Elliot Bainbridge's breathing grew slower and more labored. The room filled with important people making important decisions, but she noticed how none of them spoke to the dying man, how none held his hand or offered comfort. Shortly before dawn, his chest rose one final time, then fell still. The room seemed to hold its breath, as if the universe itself paused to acknowledge the passing of Elliot Bainbridge. Dr. Stevens arrived too late, his bow tie askew, shaking his head as he confirmed what they already knew. The efficient machinery of wealth and power began to move. Lawyers would be contacted, arrangements would be made, statements would be prepared. The Bainbridge empire would continue, even if its architect had departed. Maggie slipped the envelope and box into her worn leather bag, feeling them settle against her hip. Outside, the storm had passed, leaving the air fresh and clean, washed of impurities. The first hints of sunrise colored the horizon in pinks and golds as she walked down the long driveway, past the iron gates that had guarded Elliot Bainbridge's solitude for so many years, the gates that had kept the world out and perhaps trapped him within. Main Street was just beginning to stir as Maggie made her way through town. The bakery's lights were on, golden squares against the fading night, and she could smell fresh bread and cinnamon rolls being prepared for the day's customers. 2 early morning joggers passed, heads bent together, already sharing the news in urgent whispers. Word travelled fast in small towns, especially news this significant. By noon, everyone would know that Elliot Bainbridge, the town's most famous and reclusive resident, had passed away. Maggie's bag felt heavy against her hip, weighted not just by the box, but by the responsibility she'd been given. She thought of Rose Bainbridge. She'd seen her picture in newspapers over the years, a sharp-suited attorney with her father's penetrating eyes and determined chin. A woman who never visited her hometown, who had built her own life separate from her father's shadow, who never visited her father, not even on holidays or birthdays. What had happened between them? What could this box possibly contain that might matter now, after years of silence? The morning light grew stronger as Maggie walked home, illuminating puddles from the night's storm. Each reflected the brightening sky like tiny mirrors scattered across her path. She held close the memory of Elliot Bainbridge's last moments, when he'd shed his billions and power, becoming simply a father who remembered singing lullabies to his daughter on stormy nights. In those final moments, he hadn't wanted his accountant or his business partners. He hadn't asked for his investment portfolio or stock reports. He had wanted only to be remembered for a simple act of love, a father's imperfect song meant to comfort a frightened child. The morning after Elliot Bainbridge's death dawned bright and crisp. Maggie drove her old Honda past a cluster of news vans parked outside the estate's iron gates. Reporters clutched coffee cups and checked their phones, waiting like patient vultures for any morsel of information about the billionaire's passing. "Another Bainbridge employee!" A reporter thrust a microphone toward her car window. "Any comment on Mr. Bainbridge's final hours?" Maggie kept her eyes forward as security waved her through. The wooden box and envelope sat heavily in her bag on the passenger seat, their presence a constant reminder of her promise. Inside the mansion, the usual morning routine had transformed into something more solemn. Other staff members moved quietly, dusting and polishing with extra care, as if their ordinary tasks had become a form of tribute. "They're saying his daughter's flying in from New York," whispered Maria, one of the younger maids, as they changed linens together. "I heard she hasn't been here in years." Maggie smoothed a wrinkle from the silk bedsheet. "Let's just focus on our work," she said gently, though her heart beat faster at the mention of Rose. By early afternoon, dark clouds gathered as mourners began arriving for the private service. Father Tom Alvarez, his silver hair catching the light, stood in the mansion's small chapel, speaking quietly with Mr. Hammond, Elliot's long-time lawyer. The elderly priest had known Elliot since before his wife's death, back when the Bainbridges still attended Sunday services as a family. Maggie slipped into a back pew, watching as a handful of people filed in, mostly senior executives, and a few old friends. The air felt heavy with unspoken words and complicated histories. A rustle of expensive fabric announced Rose Bainbridge's arrival, 15 minutes after the service had begun. Heads turned as she walked down the aisle, her heels clicking sharply on the marble floor. She wore a perfectly tailored black dress and dark sunglasses, though the chapel was already dim. Without acknowledging anyone, she took her place in the front pew. Father Tom's eulogy was brief but touching. He spoke of redemption and second chances, of the mystery of God's timing. Even in our final moments, he said, his voice gentle, we can choose love. Rose sat perfectly still throughout the service, her back straight as a blade. When it ended, she was the first to leave, brushing past Mr. Hammond's attempted conversation with a curt, "Tomorrow will be soon enough." Maggie watched her go, thinking of the box in her bag. Not yet, she decided. Not today. The will reading will be at 10 o'clock tomorrow morning, Mr. Hammond announced to the dispersing mourners, in Mr. Bainbridge's study. The news rippled through the house and into the town beyond. At the local diner, Maggie overheard speculation over her lunch break. Who would inherit the estate? The business empire? What about the charitable foundation? Evening found Maggie in her small cottage on the edges of town, where lace curtains couldn't quite hide the peeling paint. She sat in her favorite armchair by the window, a cup of tea growing cold beside her. The wooden box rested on her lap, its intricate carvings catching the lamplight. Her worn leather journal lay open on the side table. She picked up her pen, needing to capture the weight of the moment. Last night I made a promise to a dying man. He trusted me with something precious, not just the box or the envelope, but a chance to heal what was broken between him and his daughter. I saw something in his eyes in those final moments. Regret, yes, but also hope. He remembered singing to her during storms. Such a small detail to hold on to at the end. Maggie's pen paused as she heard the distant toll of church bells. She checked her watch. Midnight. The sound carried clearly in the still air, marking the passing of one of the town's most prominent citizens. The night stretched long before her. She thought of Rose, probably staying in the Grand Hotel downtown rather than her childhood home. Did she hear the bells, too? Did they stir any memories of the father who had once sung her lullabies? Unable to sleep, Maggie wrote until her hand cramped, filling pages with her observations and worries. The sky gradually lightened from black to charcoal grey. More bells began to toll across town, morning services beginning as the community prepared for what everyone knew would be a significant day. She made fresh coffee and watched dawn creep over the hills. The wooden box sat on her kitchen table now, its brass key catching the first rays of morning light. Soon she would head back to the estate for her regular duties, knowing that today was anything but regular. The will reading loomed ahead, and with it, decisions about when and how to fulfill her promise to Elliot. The last echo of the morning bells faded away. Maggie washed her coffee cup and prepared for work, feeling the weight of expectations settling over the town like the grey clouds above. She carefully placed the box and envelope back in her bag, making sure the key was secure. Whatever the will might reveal, she knew her task remained unchanged. She had made a promise, and she would keep it. As she drove toward the estate, she noticed the town seemed unusually quiet, as if holding its breath. Even the reporters at the gate appeared more subdued, perhaps sensing that the real story was yet to come. The morning sun struggled to pierce the heavy curtains of Elliot Bainbridge's study, where dark wood paneling absorbed what little light made it through. The room smelled of leather and old books, with undertones of lemon polish from Maggie's careful maintenance over the years. People packed themselves into the space, their whispers creating a constant undercurrent of sound. Mr. Hammond's junior partners distributed bottles of water, and arranged chairs in neat rows. Local reporters huddled near the back, notebooks ready. Town council members adjusted their ties and smoothed their skirts, trying to look both appropriately somber and professionally alert. Rose sat in the front row, her posture rigid, fingers tapping impatiently against her leather portfolio. She'd exchanged yesterday's black dress for a charcoal suit that probably cost more than Maggie made in 3 months. Maggie found a quiet corner, feeling out of place in her simple navy dress. The wooden box seemed to grow heavier in her bag with each passing minute. At precisely 10 o'clock, Mr. Hammond cleared his throat. The room fell silent. "We are gathered here today to read the last will and testament of Elliot James Bainbridge," he began, his voice steady and practiced. He adjusted his reading glasses and lifted a thick document. The first few minutes proceeded as expected. Standard legal language about being of sound mind and body. Rose's expression grew increasingly satisfied as Mr. Hammond listed the extent of the estate's assets. Then came the shock. "To the town of Mill River, I hereby establish the following trusts." Mr. Hammond read, "First, a scholarship fund of $50 million for local students pursuing careers in healthcare and education." Gasps filled the room. Rose's head snapped up. "Second, $15 million for the establishment and maintenance of temporary housing and job training facilities for those experiencing homelessness." The whispers grew louder. Someone dropped a water bottle. Third, $20 million dedicated to supporting caregivers of chronically ill patients. The list continued. With each announcement, the fortune that everyone had assumed would go to Rose was instead directed toward the community. Maggie watched Rose's face turn from confusion to anger to something approaching horror. Then Mr. Hammond reached the part that changed everything. "To ensure these bequests are administered according to their true spirit and intent, I hereby name as executor of my estate." He paused, adjusting his glasses. "Margaret Ellen Carter." The room erupted. Rose shot to her feet, her chair scraping backward. "This is impossible," she said, her voice cutting through the chaos. "She's a housekeeper." Mr. Hammond raised his hand for quiet. "There's more," he said firmly. "To my daughter, Rose Elizabeth Bainbridge, I leave conditional ownership of the family properties, including this estate. However, these properties and additional personal bequests will only transfer upon completion of specific requirements to be revealed through cooperation with Mrs. Carter regarding a final personal request." Rose's laugh was sharp and bitter. "This is a joke. It has to be a joke." She turned to stare at Maggie, her eyes bright with fury. "What did you do? How did you convince him to do this?" Maggie stood perfectly still, her heart hammering. "I didn't." "Save it!" Rose snapped. She snatched up her belongings and strode towards the door. "My lawyers will be in touch." The door slammed behind her. Reporters were already on their phones, speaking in urgent whispers. Town officials huddled together, pointing at papers and shaking their heads. Mr. Hammond approached Maggie, holding out a thick folder. "Mrs. Carter, these documents outline your responsibilities as executor. We'll need to schedule several meetings to go over the details." Maggie took the folder with trembling hands. "I don't understand," she said quietly. "Why me?" The lawyer's expression softened slightly. "Mr. Bainbridge was very clear about his choice. He said you see people as they are, not as their bank accounts suggest they should be." The rest of the morning passed in a blur of signatures and explanations. Maggie's head spun with terms like fiduciary duty and discretionary authority. By the time she left the estate, the sun was setting. Her cottage felt smaller than usual that evening, but somehow safer. She lit the old wood stove, its warmth pushing back against the autumn chill. The folder Mr. Hammond had given her sat unopened on her kitchen table. Beside it, she placed Elliot's envelope and the wooden box. Maggie sank into her chair, exhaustion settling into her bones. The enormity of what had happened today pressed down on her. She was now responsible for millions of dollars, for decisions that would affect countless lives. She, who had spent years quietly cleaning other people's homes, was suddenly thrust into a position of power she'd never wanted or imagined. The wooden box caught the firelight, its shadows dancing across the carved surface. Whatever was inside held the key to Rose's inheritance, and perhaps to healing the rift between father and daughter. But first, Maggie would have to find a way to reach past Rose's anger and hurt. She stared at the envelope, knowing it contained Elliot's instructions, but feeling too overwhelmed to open it just yet. Tomorrow would come soon enough, bringing with it all the weight of her new responsibilities. For now, she sat in her quiet cottage, listening to the wood stove's gentle crackle, and tried to find her courage. The grandfather clock in Maggie's cottage struck midnight, its gentle chime echoing through the quiet rooms. She sat at her small kitchen table, the envelope from Elliot Bainbridge glowing white under her reading lamp. Her tea had gone cold, forgotten as she wrestled with her thoughts. "I have to know what to do next," she whispered to herself, finally reaching for the envelope. Her hands trembled slightly as she broke the seal. Inside was a single sheet of cream-colored paper, covered in careful handwriting that slanted slightly to the right. Maggie smoothed it flat, noticing how the ink had pressed deeply into the paper, as if each word had been written with great deliberation. "Dear Maggie," the letter began. "If you're reading this, I've passed on, leaving you with a tremendous responsibility. I chose you because 6 years ago, when I was at my lowest, you showed me kindness without wanting anything in return. Do you remember? I had fallen in the garden, and instead of calling for help and making a scene, you simply helped me up, brushed off my coat and said, 'Sometimes we all need a hand getting back on our feet.'" Maggie's throat tightened. She did remember that day, though she hadn't known it had meant anything special to him. "The wooden box I've given you must reach Rose. Inside is something she needs to see, but she won't be ready until she remembers who we once were to each other. There's a melody, a lullaby called 'Sailing Home,' that only Rose and I shared. It was our special song when she was little, before I let my ambition poison everything good between us. Tell her about the song. If she remembers, there's hope." Tears blurred Maggie's vision. She blinked them away and read on. "If she forgives me, the town will heal. This is my last chance to make things right, Maggie. Thank you for being the person I trust to help make that happen." The letter was signed simply, Elliot. Maggie folded the paper carefully, sliding it back into its envelope. The wooden box sat beside her, its brass key catching the lamplight. She touched its smooth surface, wondering what secrets it held. Dawn was just breaking when a knock at her door startled her from a light doze in her armchair. Father Tom stood on her porch, his kind face creased with concern. "I thought you might be up," he said. "May I come in?" Maggie stepped back, welcoming him into her small living room. "Would you like some coffee? I just made fresh." "That would be wonderful." He settled into a chair while she poured 2 cups. "I heard about the will reading yesterday. The whole town's talking about it." Maggie's hands shook slightly as she handed him his coffee. "I don't understand why he chose me." "Don't you?" Father Tom's eyes were gentle. "You've always seen the good in people, Maggie, even when they couldn't see it in themselves." She sat down, cradling her own cup. "But Rose hates me now. How can I help when she won't even talk to me? Tell me about the promise you made to Elliot." Maggie hesitated, then told him about that final night, about the box and letter, about the lullaby that might bridge the gap between father and daughter. Father Tom listened quietly, nodding. When she finished, he set down his empty cup. Promises can become lifelines, you know, not just for the person who receives them, but for the one who makes them too. Sometimes keeping our word is what helps us discover our own strength. He stood to leave, pausing at the door. You have a good heart, Maggie. Trust it to guide you. After he left, Maggie went to her bedroom and opened her closet. She chose her best dress, a simple navy blue one she usually saved for church. As she smoothed its wrinkles, she thought about Rose in her expensive suits and perfect makeup. It doesn't matter, she told her reflection as she pinned her hair neatly. Just be honest. Be respectful. That's all you can do. She packed her worn leather purse carefully. The envelope with Elliot's letter, her bus ticket to the city, a small notebook, and her mother's old rosary beads. The wooden box she wrapped in a soft cloth and tucked it in securely. The noon bus was nearly empty when Maggie boarded. She chose a seat by the window, watching as Mill River's familiar streets gave way to open countryside. As the landscape gradually shifted from autumn-touched fields to concrete and steel, she fingered her rosary beads and prayed quietly. Lord, she whispered, help me find the right words. Help me be strong enough for this task. The bus rolled on toward the city, and Maggie Carter, who had spent her life taking care of other people's homes, prepared herself to help heal other people's hearts. The gleaming glass towers of downtown made Maggie feel small as she stepped off the bus. The massive structures reached toward the clouds like modern-day monoliths, dwarfing everything around them, including her modest 5'4" frame. Her sensible shoes, worn but meticulously polished brown loafers, clicked softly against the polished marble floor of the Morrison & Associates law office building. The reception area was all sleek lines and modern art, so different from the worn comfort of the Bainbridge estate with its creaky wooden floors and faded wallpaper that had witnessed decades of life. I'm here to see Rose Bainbridge, Maggie said quietly to the receptionist, whose perfectly manicured nails, painted a bold crimson, clicked against her keyboard. The woman barely looked up, her eyes fixed on her computer screen. Do you have an appointment? The question held the practiced indifference of someone who asked it 100 times daily. No, but it's important. Please tell her it's about her father. Maggie clutched the strap of her purse a little tighter, feeling the weight of Elliot's wooden box inside. The receptionist's expression softened slightly, human concern momentarily breaking through the professional veneer. One moment. Maggie sat in one of the leather chairs, her purse clutched in her lap. The chair was stylish but uncomfortable, all angles and minimal cushioning. Around her, people in expensive suits rushed past, their shoes making sharp sounds against the floor. Each person seemed wrapped in their own important bubble, carrying briefcases and talking rapidly into cell phones. 20 minutes passed, then 30. She watched the large wall clock tick steadily forward, the second hand making its relentless journey around the face, refusing to let her patience waver. She'd waited 12 years to fulfill Elliot's final wish. She could wait another hour if necessary. Finally, the receptionist called over, her voice cutting through Maggie's thoughts. Ms. Bainbridge will see you. Down the hall, last door on the right. She pointed toward a corridor lined with framed certificates and awards. Maggie nodded her thanks and made her way down the hallway, her reflection ghosting alongside her in the glass partitions separating offices. Each step brought her closer to the confrontation she'd been, both dreading and preparing for since Elliot's passing. Rose's office was a corner suite with floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a breathtaking view of the city skyline. The space was immaculate, with minimalist furniture and not a paper out of place. She stood behind her desk, her dark suit perfectly tailored to her slim frame, her expression cold and guarded. Her auburn hair was pulled back in a sleek ponytail, highlighting sharp cheekbones that reminded Maggie so much of Elliot. "Whatever this is about, make it quick," Rose said, not offering Maggie a seat. Her arms were crossed defensively across her chest. "I have a meeting in 15 minutes with the senior partners. Your father asked me to bring you something." Maggie's voice was steady as she reached into her purse, her weathered hands contrasting with the fine leather. "The night he died." "Stop." Rose held up one hand, palm facing outward like a traffic cop. Her eyes narrowed with suspicion. "If you're trying to pull some kind of scam, you're wasting both our time. I don't accept mysterious packages from strangers claiming to have spoken to my father." "I'm not a stranger. I worked in your father's house for 12 years. Maggie kept her tone gentle but firm, standing her ground before the younger woman's intimidating presence. "As a housekeeper." Rose's tone was dismissive, the words cutting through the air like a knife. "And now suddenly you're the executor of his estate. He clearly manipulated you for some agenda of his own. That's what he did. Used people." Maggie took a deep breath, feeling the cool air fill her lungs. She'd expected this resistance, this wall of hurt disguised as contempt. "He asked me to tell you something. About a song." "A song?" Rose's laugh was sharp and brittle, like breaking glass. "This gets better and better. What next? A secret treasure map?" "A lullaby," Maggie said softly, and began to hum. The melody filled the quiet office, gentle, wistful notes that spoke of sailing ships and starlit seas, of father and daughter watching the moon rise over calm waters. Rose's face went white, colour draining away like water down a sink. She gripped the edge of her desk, papers scattering across its polished surface. "How do you—" Her voice cracked, vulnerability breaking through the professional facade. "Where did you hear that?" "Your father sang it to me, the night he died. He said it was something special between you two, something from before." Maggie didn't need to specify before what. They both knew the moment when everything had changed. The office had gone completely still. The constant hum of phones and keyboards from outside seemed to fade away. Through the glass walls, Maggie could see staff members trying not to stare, their curious glances darting toward the unfolding scene. Rose sank into her chair, the expensive leather creaking under her weight. Her carefully constructed composure was crumbling. "That song. We used to sing it every night when I was little. Before he—" She swallowed hard, her throat working visibly. "Before he became someone I didn't recognize anymore. What's in the box?" Maggie unwrapped the wooden box carefully and placed it on the desk. It was beautifully crafted from dark mahogany, with intricate carvings of waves and stars that caught the afternoon light. Rose's hands trembled slightly as she took the brass key and turned it in the lock, the tiny mechanism clicking open. Inside, nestled in faded velvet that had once been deep purple but now bordered on lavender, lay 3 items. An old map with various locations around Havenport, marked in red ink, circles and X's creating a pattern only Elliot would have understood. A sepia photograph showing a young woman holding a small child, both smiling into the camera with unguarded joy. And an envelope labelled "To the Town of Havenport" in Elliot's distinctive handwriting, his elaborate cursive both elegant and somehow sad. Rose stared at the photograph for a long moment, her fingers hovering over it as if afraid to touch it, as if it might crumble to dust or burn her skin. The woman in the photo had her eyes, Maggie realized, the same shape, the same intensity. Finally, Rose picked up both the photo and the map, slipping them into her suit jacket with a gesture that seemed both protective and furtive. "Come back tomorrow morning if you're still determined to play out whatever game this is," she said, her professional mask sliding back into place like armor. But her voice wasn't quite as sharp as before, and something in her eyes had shifted. 9 o'clock. Maggie nodded, recognizing the small victory in being given a specific time. I'll be here at 9. The afternoon sun was setting as Maggie boarded the bus back to Havenport, painting the western sky in strokes of orange and pink. She settled into a worn seat by the window, her purse, still holding Elliot's letter, secure on her lap. She watched the city fade behind her, its sharp edges softening in the golden light, glass towers transformed into pillars of fire by the setting sun. Her heart felt lighter than it had in days, though questions tumbled through her mind like autumn leaves in the wind. Who was the woman in the photograph? What did the marked locations on the map mean? And what message had Elliot left for the town in that still-sealed letter that could potentially change everything? But beneath all these questions lay a spark of hope, bright as a candle flame in a dark room. For just a moment, when that lullaby filled Rose's office, cutting through years of bitterness and pain, Maggie had glimpsed the little girl who once sang with her father about sailing ships and star-lit seas. That little girl wasn't gone, just hidden beneath layers of hurt and disappointment. And maybe, just maybe, Elliot's final plan would bring her back into the light. The morning dawned crisp and clear as Maggie's phone buzzed on her kitchen counter. Rose's name flashed across the screen, making Maggie's heart skip. I've been up all night looking at that photograph, Rose said without preamble. I want to know what this is all about. Meet me at the train station in an hour. Maggie arrived early, watching commuters hurry past with their coffee cups and briefcases. When Rose appeared, she looked different from yesterday, dressed in jeans and a sweater instead of her sharp suit, though her expression remained guarded. I brought the map, Rose said, pulling it from her bag. The first mark is at the old lighthouse. They walked to Maggie's car in awkward silence. As they drove through town, Rose pressed her forehead against the window, taking in the familiar yet strange streets. It's so different, she murmured, and exactly the same. When did you leave? Maggie asked softly. I was 14, right after my mother died. Rose's fingers twisted in her lap. Dad sent me to boarding school, said it would be better for me. Maggie nodded, remembering those days. The town was different then. People looked out for each other more. Mrs. Henderson would bake extra pies just to give away. Mr. Tucker fixed everyone's cars for whatever they could afford. I remember the summer fair, Rose said suddenly. The whole town would gather in the square. There were lanterns everywhere. They still have it, but it's smaller now, less magical somehow. The lighthouse came into view, its white tower stark against the blue sky. It had stood empty for years, but someone still maintained the grounds. Rose consulted the map as they approached the heavy wooden door. The mark shows something in the keeper's office, she said. Inside, sunlight streamed through dusty windows, illuminating old nautical instruments and weathered logbooks. The desk drawer stuck slightly as Rose pulled it open. Among forgotten papers and old pencils lay a cream-colored envelope marked Stop for 1, the beginning. Rose's hands shook slightly as she read aloud. Before the money, before the empire, I was just a boy with empty pockets and big dreams. Anna believed in those dreams when no one else did. She saw past my rough edges to something better. I didn't deserve her faith, but she gave it freely. That was her way, giving pieces of her heart to everyone who needed it. The town was different then. We all knew each other's struggles and joys. Anna taught me that true wealth isn't measured in dollars, but in the kindness we share. I forgot that lesson for too long. Much too long. Rose looked up, frowning. Who's Anna? Did you ever hear Dad mention her? Maggie shook her head. Never, but the older residents might remember. Havenport was much smaller back then. They stood in silence, watching dust motes dance in the sunbeams. Finally, Rose spoke again, her voice softer than before. I barely remember this place anymore. Sometimes I dream about that summer fair, the lights, the music, the smell of caramel apples. But when I wake up, it feels like someone else's memory. It's still your home, Maggie said gently. Even if it's changed. Rose carefully folded the note and tucked it away. There's another mark on the map for tomorrow. The old library, I think. She paused, then added, "Will you come with me?" Of course. They walked back to the car as the afternoon light began to fade. The lighthouse cast long shadows across the grass, standing sentinel as it had for generations, watching over a town that had somehow lost its way, just as Elliot had lost his. The drive back was quieter, but it was a different kind of quiet than before. Rose stared out the window again, but this time she seemed to be really seeing the town, not just looking past it. "Thank you," she said, as Maggie pulled up to her hotel. "For today. For everything." She hesitated, then added, "I still don't understand what Dad was trying to do with all this, but I'm glad I'm not doing it alone." Maggie watched her walk inside, then drove home through streets growing purple with dusk. The map might show physical locations, but she was beginning to suspect that Elliot had charted a different kind of journey, one that wound through memories and regrets, hopes and healing, marking the places where hearts had fractured and might, just might, be made whole again. The morning sun cast long shadows as Maggie and Rose stood before the old dock warehouse. Paint peeled from its weathered boards, and rusty chains clinked softly in the harbour breeze. "This is the first stop," Rose said, consulting the map. Her business suit looked out of place among the fishing nets and crab traps. Inside, the warehouse smelled of salt and old wood. Sunlight streamed through grimy windows, illuminating dancing dust motes. In a corner, behind a stack of mouldering rope, they found an envelope tucked into a beam. Rose's hands trembled slightly as she read. "After the big storm of 1989, half the fishing fleet was damaged. I couldn't show my face. Pride and shame kept me hidden. But I could fix boats. Every night for 3 months I came here with tools and lumber. The fishermen never knew who repaired their vessels. Their gratitude belonged to a stranger, and that felt right somehow." "I remember that storm," Maggie said softly. "The whole harbour was a mess." They drove to the old schoolhouse next, a brick building with ivy climbing its walls. In the library section, Rose discovered another envelope behind a loose panel. "Knowledge should never have a price tag," she read aloud. "When the school board couldn't fund new books, I found ways to help anonymously. Every child deserves a chance to learn, to dream bigger than their circumstances." Maggie watched Rose's face soften as she touched the worn spines of old books. "He really did care," Rose whispered, more to herself than to Maggie. The churchyard was their final stop. Father Tom met them by an old wooden bench, his kind eyes crinkling at the corners. "I wondered when you'd come here," he said, producing a thick ledger. "Every year on the same date, fresh flowers appeared on 3 graves. The groundskeeper never saw who left them." Rose found the envelope tucked under the bench seat. Her voice was thick as she read. "Some debts can never be repaid. Some thank yous come too late. But flowers speak when words fail, and maybe somewhere they understand." Father Tom helped them search through church records, pointing out patterns of anonymous donations that coincided with community needs: a new roof after a harsh winter, medical bills paid for struggling families. People called him the mystery benefactor. Father Tom explained. They never knew it was Elliot. Their research was interrupted by quick footsteps on the gravel path. A young woman with bright eyes and a hopeful smile approached Maggie. "Mrs. Carter, I hoped I'd find you here," she said breathlessly. "I'm Ivy Moreno, your neighbor. I just got my nursing school acceptance letter, but—" Her smile faltered. "The tuition is more than my family can manage." Maggie glanced at Rose, who was pretending not to listen while studying the church records. "Ivy, have you heard about the new Bainbridge scholarships?" "Really?" Ivy's eyes widened. "Do you think I'd qualify?" "I think that's exactly what they're meant for," Maggie said warmly. "We'll help you apply." As evening approached, Rose suggested dinner at the local diner. They sat in a worn booth, the neon signs outside painting their faces in soft colors. Rose stirred her coffee thoughtfully. "I always thought he was just cold, distant." She looked up at Maggie. "But he was helping people all along, wasn't he? Just quietly. Sometimes the biggest hearts hide behind the tallest walls." Maggie replied. Their conversation flowed easier now, warming like the coffee between them. Rose shared memories of her childhood, of moments when her father's mask had slipped to show glimpses of tenderness. Maggie listened, offering gentle insights about the town and its people. "There are more locations on the map," Rose said finally, spreading it on the table between them. "Will you help me find them all?" Maggie nodded, seeing in Rose's eyes the same mix of hope and uncertainty she felt herself. Whatever Elliot had planned, whatever truth waited at the end of this trail of memories, they would discover it together. The diner's bell chimed as new customers entered, and outside, Havenport's streets grew quiet with evening. Tomorrow would bring more revelations, more pieces of the puzzle Elliot had left behind. But for now, in this moment, two women who had started as strangers found themselves becoming something closer to friends, united by the mystery of a man who had learned, too late, the quiet power of giving. Early morning light filtered through the tall windows of Havenport's community hall, casting long shadows across the worn wooden floor. Maggie and Rose sat at a scratched oak table, joined by Mayor June Delaney, a practical woman with silver-streaked hair and reading glasses perched on her nose, and Father Tom, who folded his hands patiently before him. Rose placed the envelope marked "To the Town of Havenport" in the center of the table. Her fingers lingered on the paper for a moment before she began reading aloud. "To my hometown and its people, I owe you an apology that's long overdue. When success came, I forgot where I started. I chose towers of steel over the wooden docks where I first learned to work. I let pride build walls between myself and the community that raised me. Though I tried to help from the shadows, I know now that wasn't enough. Money can rebuild buildings, but it takes people to rebuild trust. I'm establishing a trust fund to create an annual day of service where neighbors help neighbors just as they did when I was young. The community center, where I once attended town meetings with my father, should be the first project. Make it a place where people gather again, where children play, where the elderly find company, where Havenport's heart beats strong. Let this be the beginning of healing what wealth and distance broke. With deep regret and hope for tomorrow, Elliot Bainbridge." Mayor June removed her glasses, polishing them with the edge of her cardigan. "Well," she said carefully, "it's quite something to hear Elliot Bainbridge admit he was wrong. The day of service could really bring people together," Father Tom offered. "Like the old barn raisings, but modern." Maggie watched Rose's face, seeing emotions play across it like shadows on water. "The community center needs work," Rose said, her professional mask slipping to reveal genuine interest. "I could handle the permits, make sure everything's legal. And I know plenty of folks who'd volunteer." Maggie added, "Mrs. Henderson still teaches art. She's been wanting a proper space for classes. And Mr. Chen from the hardware store, he's good with repairs." Mayor June tapped her pen against her notepad. It would take organization, planning. But she smiled slightly. It could work. Maggie, you know everyone. Could you coordinate the volunteers? I can try, Maggie said, though her heart fluttered at the responsibility. They spent the next hour sketching plans, Rose making neat lists while Maggie suggested names of willing helpers. Father Tom offered the church basement for planning meetings, and Mayor June promised to expedite the necessary paperwork. Word spread through Havenport like wildfire. By afternoon, Maggie's phone buzzed constantly with messages from townspeople wanting to help. The hardware store pledged materials at cost. The high school shop class offered to build new benches. Even the local diner promised to feed volunteers. Throughout the week, the community center hummed with activity. Rose surprised everyone by rolling up her sleeves and joining in, her suit jacket traded for jeans and a t-shirt. She worked alongside people who'd known her as a child, listening to their stories about the town's better days. Maggie moved through it all like a quiet conductor, matching skills to tasks, solving problems before they grew, bringing water to thirsty workers. She watched Rose grow more comfortable each day, saw how the townspeople's initial wariness melted into acceptance. 7 days after reading the letter, Maggie and Rose found themselves alone in the community center as evening approached. Dust motes danced in the last rays of sunlight, streaming through newly cleaned windows. They sat in the rafters, legs dangling, surveying the progress below. I forgot how many people knew me as a kid, Rose said softly. Mrs. Henderson remembered how I used to draw horses in her art class. Maggie smiled. The town has a long memory. For good things, too, not just the hard ones. We'll need more paint for the children's room, Rose mused, consulting her ever-present notebook. And someone should check the electrical in the East Wing. Jimmy Torres is an electrician now. He said he'd look at it this weekend. They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, listening to the old building settle around them. The past week had transformed not just the space, but something in the air itself. Where there had been resignation, now there was purpose. Where there had been division, bridges were being built. I never thought I'd enjoy project management quite like this, Rose admitted, brushing dust from her jeans. It's different when you can see the results right in front of you, when you know the people it's helping. That's what community is, Maggie said. Everyone bringing what they can to make things better for everyone else. They continued discussing logistics, schedules to coordinate, supplies to order, volunteers to organize. But beneath the practical talk ran a current of something deeper. The satisfaction of watching something broken begin to mend, of being part of that healing. As the light faded outside, their voices echoed in the empty hall, mixing with the ghosts of past gatherings and the promise of future ones. The work ahead was substantial, but for the first time in years, Havenport felt alive with possibility. The community center buzzed with energy as sunlight streamed through freshly washed windows. Paint fumes and sawdust mingled in the air while dozens of volunteers moved purposefully through the building, each focused on their assigned tasks. Ivy Moreno, her dark hair tied back in a bandana, carefully guided her paintbrush along the trim work. Miss Maggie, she called out, should we do a second coat on this wall? Maggie paused from where she was arranging coffee and donuts on a folding table. What do you think, Ivy? You've got good instincts. The young woman stepped back, studying the wall critically. Yeah, it needs one more. The old color's still showing through a bit. That's exactly what I was thinking. Maggie smiled warmly. Would you mind showing Sarah and Tommy how to do the trim work while you're at it? They're eager to help but need some guidance. Rose watched this exchange from across the room, noting how Maggie's gentle approach brought out the best in people. Her own management style, honed in corporate boardrooms, suddenly felt rigid in comparison. Mr. Chen from the hardware store was up on a ladder, installing new light fixtures with his teenage son's help. "Mrs. Carter," he called down, "these LED lights will save money on the electric bill. Good for 20 years, guaranteed." "Thank you, Mr. Chen, and please call me Maggie." She brought him a cup of coffee once he descended the ladder, asking about his wife's recent surgery. The personal touch wasn't lost on Rose. Throughout the day, Maggie seemed to be everywhere at once, helping Mrs. Henderson set up her future art classroom, consulting with the floor refinishers about the best sealant to use, and always making sure everyone felt appreciated. Father Tom arrived mid-afternoon with Sammy Collins, the retired postman who seemed to know every senior citizen in town. They huddled with Maggie over floor plans, pointing out spaces that could accommodate chair yoga classes and caregiver support group meetings. "The seniors need comfortable chairs," Sammy insisted, his weathered face serious. "And good lighting. Their eyes aren't what they used to be." "We'll make it work," Father Tom assured him. "The whole point is to bring people together, right, Maggie?" Maggie nodded, making notes. "Maybe we could ask the high school woodshop to build some custom benches with backs. Something sturdy but comfortable?" Rose approached the group, her sleeves rolled up and a smudge of paint on her cheek. "I can allocate funds for proper seating from the trust. We want to do this right." The afternoon wore on as volunteers cycled through, each contributing what they could. The diner sent over sandwiches for lunch, and people ate in small groups, sharing stories and suggestions for the center's future use. Ivy worked steadily with a group of other young people, their enthusiasm infectious as they transformed walls from institutional beige to warm, welcoming colors. "Miss Maggie," she called out at one point, "my mum says she'll teach Mexican cooking classes once the kitchen's ready. She makes the best tamales in town." "That would be wonderful, Ivy. We could do a whole series of cultural cooking classes." Maggie turned to Rose. "Your father used to love Mrs. Moreno's tamales. He'd order them special for staff Christmas parties." Rose's expression softened at this unexpected detail about her father. "I remember those parties, actually. They were always in this building, weren't they?" "Every December," Maggie confirmed, "before things changed." As evening approached, the day's work began winding down. The newly sealed floor gleamed in the fading light, and fresh paint brightened every wall. Someone had strung festive lights along the rafters, their warm glow reflecting off the windows. Maggie and Rose stood outside, watching as volunteers gathered their things and said their goodbyes. Laughter drifted through the open doors. Ivy and her friends were making plans to come back tomorrow, their voices full of purpose and pride. "I've never seen anything quite like this," Rose admitted, her usual professional demeanor relaxed after the day's work. "In the city, everything's so transactional. But here, it's about connection." Maggie finished softly. "About belonging." They stood in comfortable silence, listening to the happy chatter from inside. The festive lights twinkled above them like stars, casting a gentle glow over the building's freshly painted facade. For the first time in years, the community center looked alive, welcoming, full of possibility. Rose took a deep breath, and Maggie noticed her shoulders were more relaxed than they'd been since her return to Havenport. The weight of corporate ambition and old resentments seemed to have lifted, even if just for this moment. "You're really good at this, you know," Rose said suddenly. "Bringing people together, making them feel valued. I've been watching you all day." Maggie ducked her head, uncomfortable with praise. "I just treat people the way I'd want to be treated. Nothing special about that." "But it is special," Rose insisted. "I'm beginning to understand why my father trusted you with all this." Inside, someone started playing an old piano they'd uncovered and cleaned up. The melody drifted out into the evening air, accompanied by spontaneous singing and more laughter. Standing there in the growing dusk, both women felt something shift inside them, a lightness, a sense of possibility they hadn't experienced in years. Hope, no longer fragile but robust and real, seemed to pulse through the very air around them, as tangible as the fresh paint and sawdust, as warm as the lights twinkling overhead. Saturday dawned bright and clear, with just enough autumn crispness in the air to make everyone walk a little faster toward the newly renovated Bainbridge Community Centre. Colourful banners fluttered in the breeze, and the freshly painted sign above the entrance gleamed in the morning light. People streamed in from all directions, families pushing strollers, elderly couples walking arm in arm, teenagers in their Sunday best. Each group carried covered dishes for the potluck celebration, creating a procession of aluminum foil and Tupperware that spoke of shared community and home cooking. Inside, the transformation was stunning. Sunlight poured through spotless windows onto gleaming hardwood floors. The walls, now painted in warm, welcoming colours, displayed local artwork and historical photos of Havenport. Comfortable chairs lined the walls, and round tables dotted the main space, each decorated with fresh flowers from Mrs. Henderson's garden shop. Father Tom stood at the podium, his weathered face beaming as he surveyed the growing crowd. When the clock struck 11, he raised his hands for silence, and the excited chatter gradually died down. "Let us bow our heads," he began, his voice carrying to every corner of the room. "Lord, we gather today to bless this renewed space, this symbol of second chances and community healing. May it serve as a testament to the power of forgiveness and the strength we find in unity." Mayor June followed, her usual businesslike demeanor softened by genuine emotion. "What we see here today," she said, gesturing to the restored building, "is more than just fresh paint and new furniture. It's proof that Havenport's heart still beats strong, that we haven't forgotten how to come together when it matters most." Then Rose stepped forward, and a subtle tension rippled through the room. She looked different today. Less the corporate attorney, more the daughter of Havenport. Her simple dress and minimal makeup made her seem younger, more vulnerable. "I've spent years running from this town," she began, her voice quiet but steady. "Running from memories, from responsibilities, from unfinished business." She paused, drawing a deep breath. "My father wasn't perfect, neither am I, but he left us with something precious, not just money or buildings, but a chance to remember who we are as a community, a chance to forgive, to rebuild, to start again." Tears glistened in her eyes, but she continued. "Looking around this room, seeing what you've all accomplished together, I finally understand what he was trying to tell me. Sometimes the most important things we leave behind aren't things at all. They're the changes we inspire in others." The room fell silent, absorbing her words. Then Maggie stepped up, clutching a small piece of paper. Her hands trembled slightly as she smoothed it out. "I'm not used to speaking in front of crowds," she said softly. "But sometimes being a caretaker means more than just looking after things. Sometimes it means holding on to someone's last request until the right moment comes to let it bloom." The warmth of the applause that followed felt almost surreal to Maggie, like a wave of kindness washing over her. She stepped back, blinking rapidly, as Mayor June returned to the podium. "And now," the mayor announced, "it gives me great pleasure to announce the first recipient of the Bainbridge Educational Trust Scholarship. This young woman exemplifies the spirit of community service and dedication that will help Havenport thrive. Please congratulate Ivy Moreno." Ivy's hands flew to her mouth, her eyes wide with disbelief. She started crying before she even reached the podium, and suddenly she was surrounded by neighbors. The same people who had barely noticed her before were now hugging her, patting her back, celebrating her success as if she were their own daughter. "I promise," she managed through her tears, I'll make you all proud. I'll come back and help take care of our community, just like others have taken care of me." The formal ceremony gave way to celebration. Tables groaned under the weight of hometown cooking. Mrs. Moreno's famous tamales, Sarah Chen's dumplings, Betty Wilson's legendary apple pies. Someone started playing the restored piano, and soon the center was filled with music and laughter. Rose found Maggie by the punch bowl, both of them watching as couples began to dance. "Did you ever imagine it could be like this?" Rose asked. "Your father did," Maggie replied softly. "That's why he left us the map, the letters, the tasks. He knew what the town needed to remember." The celebration continued into the evening. Children played tag between the tables while their parents danced and chatted. Elderly residents shared stories with teenagers who, for once, seemed genuinely interested in the town's history. The divisions that had marked Havenport for so long seemed to fade in the warm light of community and shared joy. As darkness fell, Maggie slipped away from the festivities, walking home through streets that felt somehow different, lighter, more hopeful. In her small cottage, she carefully removed Elliot's letter from her bag and tucked it into her Bible for safekeeping. The first drops of rain began to fall as she sat by her window, humming the lullaby Elliot had shared. The same melody he used to sing to Rose, now a bridge between past and present, between father and daughter, between a town and its future. 2 days later, the warmth of celebration gave way to whispers. People gathered in small groups on street corners, heads bent over phones, faces worried. At the diner, conversation stopped when certain people walked in, and then the headline appeared online, bold and accusatory, threatening to unravel everything they'd worked so hard to rebuild. The morning headlines hit Havenport like a thunderclap. "Bainbridge fortune built on lies?" screamed the Business Journal's front page, complete with a grainy photo of Elliot looking shadowy and suspicious. Mr. Carlton, a silver-haired businessman who'd competed with Elliot for decades, wore an expression of fake concern as he spoke to reporters. "I hate to be the bearer of bad news," Carlton said, his voice smooth as honey. "But there are serious questions about where that money came from. Unpaid vendors, mysterious account transfers. Someone needs to protect the town from becoming entangled in fraud." Rose's phone buzzed non-stop with calls from reporters and lawyers. She paced her temporary office at the community center, her face tight with stress. "They're trying to freeze the trust accounts," she told Maggie, running her fingers through her hair. "Carlton's pushing for a full investigation." Outside, a small group of protesters had gathered, their signs reading, "No dirty money," and "Truth before trust." The sight made Maggie's stomach knot. Just days ago, these same people had been dancing and celebrating together. At the diner, conversation stopped when Maggie walked in. Mrs. Chen, who'd brought dumplings to the opening, turned away quickly. Betty Wilson gathered her purse and left without finishing her coffee. "Did you know?" Someone whispered loudly enough for Maggie to hear. "That housekeeper must have planned this whole thing, probably getting paid off somewhere." Maggie's hands shook as she carried her coffee to a corner booth. The warmth of community she'd felt just days ago seemed to evaporate like morning dew. Father Tom found her there, sliding into the seat across from her. His kind face showed concern. "People are scared," he said gently. "Fear makes them forget what they know in their hearts to be true." "But what if they're right?" Maggie's voice cracked. "What if we've all been fooled? You saw those letters, Maggie. You followed that map. Trust what you know, not what others whisper." Rose burst through the diner door, her face pale. "I have to go back to Boston," she said, dropping into the booth beside them. "The lawyers need access to old records. They're talking about criminal investigations." Maggie watched the younger woman's hands tremble as she grabbed a napkin. The corporate attorney facade had cracked, revealing the hurt daughter beneath. "What about the center?" Maggie asked. "The scholarship program? Everything's on hold until we sort this out." Rose's voice was bitter. "Carlton's doing what he does best, finding weak spots and pressing hard. He always envied Dad's success." Outside, more protesters had gathered. Someone had spray-painted fraud across the community center's new sign. Ivy Moreno stood at the edge of the crowd, tears streaming down her face as she watched her scholarship dreams crumbling. "I'll stay," Maggie said firmly. "Someone needs to keep things going, keep people believing." Father Tom nodded. "I'll help. We'll hold town meetings, keep communications open. Truth has a way of rising to the surface." Rose gathered her things, exhaustion evident in every movement. "I'll dig through every file, every record. Carlton won't get away with this." That evening, Maggie sat in her cottage, staring at Elliot's letter. The paper felt worn now from multiple readings, but the words still rang true. She thought about the lighthouse, the dock warehouse, the quiet acts of kindness they'd uncovered. Her phone lit up with another message. Someone had started a social media campaign questioning her role in the Bainbridge scandal. The words hurt, but something deeper than hurt kept her steady. Miles away in Boston, Rose sat surrounded by boxes of old files, her eyes burning from hours of reading. Her father's signature crossed document after document, each one a piece of the puzzle she needed to solve. Both women, though separated by distance, shared the same determined thought. The truth would come out. Not for their own sakes, but for the sake of a town that had just begun to remember how to hope again. The rain started falling outside Maggie's window, drumming against the glass like tiny fists demanding answers. She pulled out her journal and began to write, documenting everything they'd learned, every stop on the map, every story they'd uncovered. Something in all of this had to point to the truth. In Boston, Rose ignored another call from a reporter and kept digging through the files. Her father had been many things, distant, complicated, regretful, but she refused to believe he had built his legacy on lies. There had to be evidence to prove Carlton wrong, and she would find it. The night grew deeper, but neither woman slept. Too much hung in the balance, not just money or reputations, but the fragile trust of a community that had just started to heal. The morning light barely filtered through Boston's glass towers as Rose sat at her desk, surrounded by stacks of legal documents. Her phone buzzed constantly. Reporters, fellow attorneys, board members all demanding answers she didn't have. "Ms. Bainbridge." Her assistant knocked softly. "Mr. Whitman from the Oversight Committee is on line 1. Rose rubbed her temples. "Tell him I'll call back in an hour." She turned to the computer screen, scanning through decades of corporate records. Something was wrong. The early ledgers, the ones that would show exactly how her father built his initial fortune, were missing. Not just misplaced, completely absent from the digital archives. "Sarah," she called to her assistant, "get me access to the physical archives. There has to be a paper trail from the 1980s. Back in Havenport, Maggie walked past the community center, her heart sinking at the sight of empty parking spaces where volunteers' cars should have been. Inside, the fresh paint seemed to mock their recent celebration. Mrs. Peterson, who'd been organizing the senior reading program, left a terse voicemail. "Given the circumstances, I think it's best we postpone indefinitely." The morning sunshine couldn't warm the chill of sideways glances and hushed conversations that followed Maggie through town. At the grocery store, she overheard 2 women whispering. Always seemed too good to be true, didn't it? A housekeeper suddenly in charge of millions? Maggie clutched her shopping basket tighter, fighting back tears. A knock at the center's door startled her from her thoughts. Ivy stood there, clutching a small envelope, her young face determined despite red-rimmed eyes. "Miss Maggie," she said, stepping inside. "I know it's not much, but—" She held out the envelope. "It's my savings from working at the diner. Maybe it can help keep the lights on until this all gets sorted out." Maggie's hands trembled as she opened the envelope. Inside was $843 in carefully counted bills. "Ivy, I can't take your money," Maggie protested. "Please!" Ivy's voice cracked. "This center, the scholarship, it's the first time I felt like my dreams mattered to anyone besides my mum. I don't want to lose that." The moment struck Maggie deeply. This was what Elliot had wanted. Not just buildings or programs, but hope taking root in young hearts. In Boston, Rose's frustration mounted. The archive access revealed another dead end. The crucial ledgers were under legal hold, trapped in bureaucratic limbo. "They're playing games," her colleague Marcus warned. "Carlton's team is dragging this out, letting public opinion do their dirty work." Rose's phone lit up with another call from her law firm's partners. The message was clear: distance yourself or risk your career. That evening she called Maggie, her voice heavy with defeat. "The evidence we need is locked away," Rose said. "And every hour this drags on. My firm looks worse. They're talking about asking me to take a leave of absence. We can't give up." Maggie insisted. "Your father left us those letters, that map. There has to be something here in town, some proof of how he really did business." "Be realistic, Maggie. This isn't some Hallmark movie where everything works out because we believe hard enough. This is my career, my whole life at stake." "And what about Ivy?" Maggie's voice rose. "She brought me her savings today, $800 to keep the center open. Are we supposed to just tell her sorry? It was too hard?" "Don't guilt-trip me," Rose snapped. "You don't understand what I'm facing here." "Maybe not," Maggie said quietly. "But I understand what your father was trying to fix, and I made him a promise." The call ended in tense silence. Maggie sat in her cottage, staring at the wooden box that had started it all. Tomorrow would bring more cold shoulders, more doubts, more challenges. But she thought of Ivy's envelope, of the hope in that young woman's eyes. Before going to bed, she pulled out her journal and wrote, "Sometimes the biggest acts of courage are the smallest acts of faith. Tomorrow we start again." The night stretched long, but when dawn broke, Maggie was already up. She had work to do, leads to follow, and a promise to keep. Whatever proof existed of Elliot's honest dealings, she would find it. Not just for Rose or herself, but for every person who had dared to believe in second chances. The morning sun cast long shadows across Main Street as Maggie hurried toward St. Michael's Church. Her footsteps echoed on the worn stone steps leading to Father Tom's office, where she found him deep in conversation with Sammy Collins. "Come in, Maggie," Father Tom called, noting her anxious expression. "You look like you haven't slept." "I haven't, not really." Maggie sank into a chair, clutching her bag. "Rose found out there's a missing ledger from Mr. Bainbridge's early business days. Without it, we can't prove he did everything properly." Sammy Collins, his weathered face thoughtful, leaned forward. "A ledger, you say? From when exactly?" "The 1980s, when he first started building the company." "Well now." Sammy scratched his chin. "That brings something to mind. You remember Mrs. Lang, Father Tom? Eleanor Lang?" Father Tom's eyes lit up. "The bookkeeper. Of course, she worked for Elliot for what, 20 years? 23. Sammy corrected. "Sharpest mind with numbers I ever knew. Retired about 10 years back, but she still lives over on Maple Grove." Maggie sat straighter. "Do you think she might know something about the old records?" "Worth asking," Father Tom said. "Eleanor was devoted to Elliot, defended him fiercely whenever anyone questioned his business practices. Within the hour, they pulled up to a small yellow bungalow with perfectly tended flower boxes. Mrs. Lang answered their knock immediately, as if she'd been watching for Visitors. Samuel Collins, she said, adjusting her glasses. And Father Tom, what brings you to my door with such serious faces? They introduced Maggie and explained the situation. Mrs. Lang invited them inside, her movements still graceful despite her 82 years. The living room was neat as a pin, with photographs spanning decades arranged carefully on the walls. So they're saying Elliot cheated people? Mrs. Lang's voice turned sharp. That he built his fortune dishonestly? There are accusations, Maggie said gently. And without the original ledgers to prove otherwise. Mrs. Lang stood abruptly. Wait here. They listened to her footsteps climb the stairs. Father Tom and Sammy exchanged glances. Minutes later, she returned carrying a worn leather folder. I shouldn't have kept these, she said, settling back into her chair. But something told me to. 35 years as a bookkeeper teaches you to trust your instincts. Her hands trembled slightly as she opened the folder. I made copies of everything. Every transaction, every payment, every note Elliot made about his decisions. Maggie leaned forward as Mrs. Lang spread out yellowed papers covered in neat columns of numbers and precise handwriting. Here. Mrs. Lang pointed, tears gathering in her eyes. October 1983, the Carlton dispute. They claim Elliot never paid his share of the harbour development costs. But look, 3 payments, all documented. And here's the letter from the bank confirming the transfers. She pulled out more papers. And this, the community repair fund he started in 1985. 5% of every major contract went into it. No fanfare, no tax write-offs. Just quiet help when the town needed it. Why didn't Mr. Bainbridge ever defend himself when people questioned his methods? Maggie asked. Mrs. Lang smiled sadly. Elliot believed action spoke louder than words. He'd say, let them think what they want, Ellie. The truth is in the numbers. Father Tom studied a page of calculations. These are thorough. Official copies? Notarized, Mrs. Lang confirmed. I may have been overly cautious, but I've seen too many good people ruined by paperwork gone missing at convenient times. Maggie carefully gathered the documents. Mrs. Lang, would you be willing to speak publicly about these records if needed? The older woman straightened her shoulders. For Elliot? Absolutely. That man gave me a chance when no one would hire a widow with 3 kids. Paid for my Tommy's college when I couldn't. The least I can do is speak truth for him now. They left Mrs. Lang's house with the precious folder and her promise to help. Maggie called Rose immediately. Come home, she said simply. I think we found what we need. That evening, Rose arrived looking exhausted, her suit wrinkled from travel. They spread the documents across Maggie's kitchen table while Father Tom made coffee. Look at these notes in the margins, Rose said, voice growing stronger with each page. Dad recorded every decision, every reason. Here, he took a loss on the Miller contract because Mr. Miller was ill. And this, he covered payroll for 3 companies during the recession so no one would lose their jobs. Maggie watched hope return to Rose's face. These prove everything we've been saying about who your father really was. We need to present this carefully, Rose said, professional instincts kicking in. A public statement, with Mrs. Lang there to verify the documents, will need to have everything authenticated first. They worked late into the night, organizing papers and planning their response. The folder's contents painted a clear picture. Not of a ruthless businessman, but of someone who had built success while quietly ensuring others didn't fall behind. Dad kept his promises, Rose whispered, touching her father's familiar handwriting. All these years he kept his promises. Maggie smiled, remembering her own promise made at Elliot's bedside. Yes, she said softly. He did. The town hall's wooden doors groaned under the pressure of the crowd gathering for the emergency meeting. Evening sunlight streamed through tall windows, casting long shadows across anxious faces. Reporters clutched notepads while townspeople whispered among themselves, their voices a nervous hum beneath the rafters. Rose stood at the podium, her usual corporate polish softened by 2 days of preparation and soul-searching. Maggie and Father Tom flanked her like anchors, steady and supportive. Mrs. Lang sat in the front row, the authenticated folder of records placed carefully in her lap. "Thank you all for coming," Rose began, her voice clear but humbled. 2 days ago, accusations were made about my father's business practices and the legitimacy of his fortune. Today, I want to share the truth, not just through numbers but through the story they tell. She lifted the first page from Mrs. Lang's records, hands steady now. October 1983, the Carlton Harbour Development Project. Every disputed payment is documented here, with bank confirmations and dates. She held up the yellowed papers. But what's more telling are my father's notes in the margins. Rose read aloud, "Ensure extra support for dock workers during winter repairs. Families need steady income through slow season." Her voice caught slightly. These ledgers show more than balanced books. They show a man who understood that business decisions affect real lives. Mrs. Lang nodded encouragingly as Rose continued through the evidence. Each page revealed another layer of Elliot's quiet generosity. Anonymous donations to repair storm damage, covered medical bills for employees' families, small business loans forgiven during hard times. "My father wasn't perfect," Rose acknowledged, looking up from the papers. "He made mistakes, especially with family. But these records prove he never cheated anyone. Instead, he gave more than required, often in ways no one knew about." Ivy stood next, smoothing her nurse's aide uniform with trembling hands. "A week ago, I was just hoping to somehow find tuition money for nursing school. Today, I'm enrolled in classes, thanks to the Bainbridge Scholarship." Her voice grew stronger. "When people started saying the money was dirty, I felt sick. But now I know it came from someone who believed in helping others quietly, without taking credit. That makes me even more determined to make the most of this chance." The mood in the room shifted perceptibly. Mayor June requested to speak, her usual political polish replaced by genuine emotion. "I've lived here 40 years, she said. "Watch the Bainbridge fortune grow, sometimes with suspicion. But these records show what we didn't see, how much was given back through channels we never knew about. I think we owe both the living and the dead an apology." Harold Miller, owner of the hardware store, stood up next. "My daddy's store would have gone under in '89 if not for a mysterious loan that showed up right when we needed it most. I always wondered—" He turned to Rose. "It was your father, wasn't it?" Rose nodded, and Harold's eyes filled with tears. "Then I need to say I'm sorry for the things I said last week. Real sorry." One by one, others rose to share similar stories. Mysterious help during hard times, anonymous donations that saved businesses or homes. Mrs. Lang added her own testimony about Elliot's integrity, her voice firm despite her age. Through it all, Maggie watched the transformation happening in the room. The suspicion that had poisoned the air just days ago dissolved into something warmer, truer. She saw it in the way shoulders relaxed, in how people began to lean toward each other instead of away. Finally, Rose held up the legal notice she'd received that morning. "The trust has been cleared of all suspicion. The evidence proves the money was earned honestly and given generously. The community center can reopen immediately, and all programs will continue as planned." Applause erupted, startling in its intensity. People surged forward, some to examine the documents more closely, others to apologize to Maggie for their doubt. Father Tom beamed proudly at the scene of reconciliation. "Maggie," several voices called out, "we should have trusted you. You've always been honest with us." The crowd's energy shifted from somber investigation to joyful planning. Someone suggested a proper reopening celebration for the center. Another voice called for making Mrs. Lang's records part of the town's historical archives. Mayor June began organizing committees on the spot. As the crowd thinned, Rose found her way to Maggie's side. For a moment they stood in silence, watching their neighbors file out into the evening light, many lingering to chat on the steps outside. "Thank you," Rose said softly, "for believing in him, for believing in all of this." Maggie turned to face her, seeing in Rose's eyes the same mix of relief and wonder she felt herself. Without words, they moved into a warm embrace, the kind that dissolves barriers built by years of misunderstanding. From the back of the hall came a unanimous cry. "Open the center tonight! Why wait?" The remaining crowd took up the call, and soon keys were produced, lights switched on, and people began streaming toward the community center, carrying the energy of reconciliation with them into the growing dusk. Morning light streamed through the newly cleaned windows of the Bainbridge Community Center as Maggie arranged fresh flowers on the welcome desk. The polished floors gleamed, and the walls, freshly painted in warm cream, made the space feel both elegant and welcoming. Already the sound of voices and laughter filled the halls. "Miss Carter!" Ivy burst through the door, waving an official-looking envelope. "It came! The full scholarship! It's really happening!" Maggie's heart swelled as she embraced the young woman. Ivy's eyes sparkled with happy tears as she showed Maggie the acceptance letter from the nursing program. "You deserve this," Maggie said softly. "Your dedication earned it." "I still can't believe it." Ivy clutched the letter to her chest. "My mom cried when I told her. She won't have to work double shifts anymore to help me with tuition." Throughout the morning, people filtered in and out of the center. The new job training program had already enrolled 30 participants, and the caregiver support group was set to begin that afternoon. Father Tom dropped by with coffee and pastries for the volunteers, his face brightening at the bustling activity. Around noon, Rose arrived wearing a simple blazer instead of her usual formal suit. She carried a stack of papers and wore an expression Maggie had come to recognize as barely contained excitement. "Can we talk?" Rose asked, gesturing toward the small office they now shared. Inside, Rose spread the papers across their desk. "The board approved it unanimously," she announced. "We're establishing the Carter Bainbridge Caregiver Endowment. It will provide stipends to family caregivers who need financial support." Maggie sat down hard in her chair. "Carter Bainbridge?" "You earned this," Rose said firmly. "Your work, your compassion, they're as much a part of this foundation as my father's money." Before Maggie could protest, a reporter from the local paper appeared in the doorway. "Mind if I get a photo for tomorrow's feature? We're calling it From Maid to Miracle, How One Woman's Promise Changed a Town." Maggie felt her cheeks flush. "That's really not necessary." "It is," Rose interrupted gently. "People need to see that extraordinary things can come from ordinary kindness." The afternoon passed in a blur of activity. Maggie helped organize the first caregiver support meeting, watching as neighbors who had struggled alone for years finally found connection and understanding. She overheard snippets of conversation about job interviews scheduled, about hope, renewed, about bridges being rebuilt. As evening approached, Rose touched Maggie's arm. "Walk with me?" They strolled together to the pier, their footsteps echoing on the weathered boards. The setting sun painted the water in shades of gold and pink. They stopped at the railing, watching boats bob gently in the harbor. "I used to hate this town," Rose admitted quietly. "I thought it was small, limiting. I blamed it for taking my father away from me, never understanding he was the one who chose to distance himself." Maggie listened, noting how Rose's defensive edge had softened over the weeks. "But now," Rose continued, "I see what he was trying to tell us with that box, those letters. He learned too late that wealth means nothing without connection, without using it to lift others up. Grief can teach us," Maggie reflected. "Sometimes it shows us what matters most. You know what amazes me?" Rose turned to face her. "How his remorse, his desire to make things right, ended up creating something neither of us expected. This partnership." Maggie smiled. "We balance each other well. You know how to navigate the legal world, how to protect what we're building. I just try to keep us connected to the heart of it, the people we're here to help." "More than that," Rose said. "You help me remember to slow down, to listen, to see people as people, not problems to solve." They watched a seabird dive into the waves, emerging with its catch. "The reporters keep asking how this miracle happened," Maggie said. "But it wasn't really a miracle, was it? Just people choosing to trust, to forgive, to try again." "Maybe that is the miracle," Rose replied. "That we can choose to be better than our hurts." They turned back toward town, walking slowly as stars began to appear above them. The community center's windows glowed warmly in the distance, and even from here they could see people gathering for the evening programs. "Ready for tomorrow?" Rose asked. "One day at a time," Maggie answered, her voice steady with quiet certainty. That's how healing happens. 6 months passed like water flowing beneath the harbour bridge, steady and sure. Spring painted Havenport in gentle colours. Pale green buds on the maple trees, purple crocuses pushing through soil, and pink cherry blossoms dotting the community centre's courtyard. Inside the centre, life pulsed with renewed purpose. The main hall echoed with voices from computer literacy classes, job training sessions, and support group meetings. Photos lined the corridor walls. Ivy in her nursing scrubs, beaming next to her classmates. Elderly neighbours sharing coffee at the weekly friendship circle. Children sprawled on new carpet in the reading corner. Maggie settled into her part-time role with natural grace. She reviewed caregiver grant applications at a desk that still felt too grand, carefully reading each story of struggle and need. Her suggestions carried weight now, which families needed immediate help, how to stretch resources further, when to make exceptions to rules. She kept a box of tissues handy for the tough conversations and a pot of tea ready for celebrations. The garden behind her cottage flourished under her evening attention. She planted herbs for cooking, flowers for beauty, and vegetables to share. Sometimes she caught herself humming Eliot's lullaby while pulling weeds or watering seedlings, the melody as familiar now as her own heartbeat. Rose's visits became a comfortable rhythm. She'd arrive with her briefcase, but also bearing treats, still warm muffins from the bakery Maggie loved, fresh bread, or sometimes just good coffee. They'd review foundation business first, then let conversation meander to personal shores. Rose's dating mishaps in the city, Maggie's adventures in learning to use social media, shared jokes about the local paper's occasional overblown headlines about their work. "Dad would have loved this," Rose said one afternoon, watching children race past the centre's windows. "Not the attention or the praise, just knowing people had what they needed." The wooden box held pride of place on Maggie's windowsill, catching morning light that made its brass key shine like a tiny beacon. She dusted it daily, this simple vessel that had carried such transformation. Sometimes visitors asked about it, and she'd smile, telling them it was a reminder that the smallest things, a promise, a melody, an act of trust, could change everything. Letters and photos arrived regularly from scholarship recipients. Ivy's updates were particularly cherished. Her first successful blood draw, her high marks in anatomy, her growing confidence. I think about the center every day, she wrote. How one person believing in you can make all the difference. That soft spring afternoon, Maggie sat in her favorite chair by the window. Outside, the harbor stretched silver blue toward the horizon. She lifted the wooden box from its place, feeling its familiar weight, running her fingers along its smooth edges. The brass key caught a sunbeam, scattering light across her hands. "Thank you," she whispered to Elliot's memory, "for trusting me, for seeing something in me I couldn't see in myself." Children's laughter floated up from the center where an after-school program was in full swing. The old lighthouse began its evening sweep, steady and reliable as always. Maggie watched the tide roll in, carrying small boats on its gentle swells, while seabirds wheeled and called in the warming air. The scene before her, the busy center, the restored lighthouse, the harbor full of working boats, spoke of a town renewed. Not just in buildings or programs, but in spirit. Neighbors greeted each other again, looked out for one another, shared burdens and joys alike. The invisible walls of wealth and class that had divided them for so long had crumbled, replaced by bridges of understanding. She traced the box's brass hinges, remembering that stormy night when everything changed. How heavy it had felt then, laden with responsibility and uncertainty. Now it rested light in her hands, empty of everything except memory and meaning. The tide continued its ancient rhythm, waves breaking against the shore in gentle percussion. Salt air drifted through her open window, carrying the promise of summer. In the distance, the community center's doors stayed open late, light spilling onto the evening sidewalk, welcoming anyone who needed a place to belong.